So far in this summer sermon series, we have recalled the names and lives of 3 biblical characters: Eve, Naomi, and Esther. Each one, in her own way, wrestled with life and the uncertainty of death. Today, we lean into the other part of our series, Unnamed. The character for today's scripture has a lengthy story, and she is not one who's likely to be dismissed, but we never learn her name. Instead, she's referred to as the Shunammite woman, and her story is found in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 through 37. Before you see her story, how many of you are familiar with it? She is not as well known. I invite you to hear her story. I want to give advance notice. Some parts of it are odd. Some might even be a bit difficult to hear. One day, Elisha came to Shunem. There was a rich woman there who urged him to eat something. And so whenever he came to Shunem, he went to her and had something to eat. The woman said to her husband, "Look, I know that this man is a holy man of God, and he comes here regularly. Let's build a room for him on the roof, and there'll be a bed, and a table, and a chair, and a desk. Then whenever he comes here, he can stay there." One day, Elisha came to the house, went to the room on the roof, and lay down. He called to his servant, Gehazi, "Call this Shunammite woman." And she came. Elisha said to Gehazi, "Say to the Shunammite woman, look, you have done all of this for us. What can we do for you? Would you like us to say a word to the king or to the commander of the army?" The Shunammite woman replied, "I'm content to live among my own people." Elisha said to Gehazi, "So what shall we do for her?" Gehazi said, "Well, she has no son, and her husband is old." And so Elisha said, "Call her." Gehazi called the Shunammite woman, and she came and stood at the door. Elisha said, "This time next year, you will have given birth to a son." But she said, "No, man of God, sir, do not deceive your servant." But she conceived, and she gave birth to a son about a year later. This is what the prophet had said. the child grew up. And one day, he called to his father, who was with the harvest workers. And he said to his father, "Oh, Father, my head, my head." And his father called one of the young men who was there and said, "Take the boy to his mother." The young man picked up the boy and brought him to the mother. She held him on her lap until noon. And the child died. She picked up the child, went up to the room on the roof, laid him on the bed of the man of God. And she closed the door behind her. Then she said to her husband, "Get a donkey and one of your servants so that I may hurry to go to see the man of God." Her husband said, "Why do you want to see him? It's not the new moon or Sabbath." She said, "Don't worry about it." And she saddled the donkey and said to the servant, "Ride the donkey hard and do not stop unless I say so." And she hurried off to the man of God at Mount Carmel. But the man of God saw her from a distance and said to Gehazi, "Look, it's the Shunammite woman. Go to her and ask her, 'Are you okay? Is your husband okay? Is your son okay?'" But she answered, "Everything's okay." But when she got to Elisha, she grabbed him around the feet. Gehazi tried to push her away, but Elisha said, "Leave her alone. She's obviously distraught, but the Lord hasn't revealed to me why." The woman said, "Did I ask you for a son, sir? Didn't I say, 'Don't raise my hopes'?" Elisha said to Gehazi, "Take my staff and go quickly, and don't stop to greet anyone along the way, and if anyone greets you, don't answer. Lay my staff on the boy's face." But the woman said to Elisha, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave without you." And so Elisha got ready and followed her. Gehazi went on ahead and came to the room and laid the staff on the boy's face. But there was no breathing and no response. And so he went back and met Elisha, saying, "The boy hasn't woken up." Then Elisha went into the house, up to the room, to the bed where the boy lay. He closed the door behind the two of them. And he prayed to the Lord. Then he lay on top of the boy, his mouth to his mouth, his eyes to his eyes, his hands to his hands. And as he bent over the boy, his skin became warm Elisha got down and paced around the house. And then he bent over the boy again. And this time, the boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha called to Gehazi, "Call the Shunammite woman." She came. And Elisha said to her, "Pick up your son." She fell at his feet, her face down to the ground. And then she went to her boy. Lifted him and left with him. So, what are we to do with this nameless yet tenacious woman? What are we to do with her story? Why is it included in the Bible, and what are we supposed to gain from it? As you may know, 1st and 2nd Kings include a number of women, most of them nameless. They are largely outside the spheres of power, unlike Jezebel, who is named and is decidedly adversarial to Elijah. By contrast, in 1 Kings 17, Elijah received water and food from a widow at Zarephath. In return, she had flour and oil to last throughout a 3.5-year drought. Later, her son became ill and died, and Elijah prayed to God and brought the child back to life in a way very similar to what you saw for Elisha. Today's story is part of 4 miraculous healing stories by Elisha. He had just taken on the mantle of his mentor Elijah, and he was establishing himself among the company of prophets. Chapters 4 and 5 include these 4 miracle stories. This is the second of them. Just before this story is an account of a poor widow who is about to lose her son to debts owed. Both she and the Shunammite woman show extravagant hospitality, one out of desperation, the other out of abundance. One reason this story is included could be to show that Elisha truly followed in the footsteps of Elijah. He too could make resources multiply. He too could bring children back to life. There are times when Elisha seems full of his sense of power, at least as I read it. There are only 2 places in the story where he speaks directly to the woman. Otherwise, he shuts her or tries to shut her out of the conversation, talking about her instead of to her, even though she is clearly capable of responding. Meanwhile, although the woman declares multiple times that this is a man of God, he doesn't do a lot of direct talking with God. At one point, he appeared less concerned about the woman's anguish than the fact that the Lord had not revealed it to him ahead of time. The narrative only includes him praying once, and this is after other plans have failed. Elisha's authority as a prophet may be why this story is included, but it's not necessarily what we need to hear from it. Most online searches about this woman include her hospitality, her faith that ultimately leads to having her child and having that child restored to health. without rejecting those pieces. I think there's more to her life and to her story buried in these often overlooked verses. There's a fairy tale quality to the story. 3 times in the narration it says, one day, and it's similar to once upon a time. An indication that this is less about a historic rendering of events and more that something unusual is about to happen. The meaning of the word Shunem can be peaceful or a quiet place. But the events that unfold are not peaceful. Behind the scenes, behind closed doors, a lot is happening here. In this peaceful place where assumptions about her might have been whispered or spoken. After all, she is wealthy, but has no son, a reality that many thought shameful in that time and place. Along with the repetition of one day, there are 3 references to door or doorway, where the woman and her husband built this room for Elisha. When Elisha called her, she stood at the doorway, a threshold space. She stands between one reality and another. She didn't enter the room that she had helped to make, perhaps out of respect for this man of God, but she also didn't back away from the possibility of holy encounter. It is in that space that Elisha first told her that she would have a son in due season, with words that might have sounded like the words spoken to Sarah long ago. Gehazi and Elisha assumed that she would want a son. They don't ask her. I wonder how she felt about it. I wonder if her husband had an opinion about it, who is about as flat a character as you could ever hope to have. Later, when the son becomes ill or injured, she held him on her lap as life faded. And when he died, she carried him to the room that she had prepared for Elisha, laying him on the very same bed that he used when he came to visit, and closed the door behind her. It was as if she was trying to shut out death or the next steps that would have been common to follow. As parents who have had to say goodbye to a child know too well, there is perhaps no greater pain imaginable. Some parents keep their child's room preserved just as it was for a long time, as if to keep out the passage of time, to deny in any way they can that death has come. This woman didn't deny what had happened, but she refused to accept that this was the end of the story. Determined to do something, she immediately went to Elisha. Jewish midrashim, stories that fill in the blanks, add that she called herself an empty vessel. It had been filled and now was poured out. Like many women of many places and times, she knew what it was like to be closed off. Her grief came not only from loss, but longing. And she refused to let Elisha send her away empty. She stood before him and insisted he come back with her. And when Elisha came to the house, he went to the room that had been prepared for him. This time, Gehazi and the woman were both shut out while Elisha prayed. Then he brought God's presence and breath to the boy until he sneezed, a sign that life had returned. And although the story doesn't say, I imagine she didn't need to be called. I imagine her right outside the door where her son lay, waiting, hoping that there would be a different outcome than her worst fears. There is always more to a person than what we can see or assume on the surface. Like Esther's story last week, we are reminded through the Shunammite woman of what is behind closed doors or surface appearances. Long before Lin-Manuel Miranda used the words in Hamilton, she longed to be in the room where it happened. The place where God's presence and breath brought life to what was dead. Maybe she realized in that moment that it had already happened with her when she gave birth to her son. That breath didn't begin externally, but internally. And behind surface limitations or realities, she made plans, she took action, she openly felt the grief of loss, and finally felt the restoration of hope as her son was returned to her. As Richard Nelson names in the interpretation commentary on 1st and 2nd Kings, in the miracle stories of 2 Kings 4, where life is threatened, the power of God breaks into hopelessness and shatters it with a word of life. For me, this is ultimately a story of offering and claiming space. In offering Elisha and Gehazi what they needed, she discovered what she needed as well. Healing and hope were part of the story, but they came with courage and tenacity to not simply settle for things happening to the one that she loved or to her. She pursued justice, holding death itself at bay until she could figure out something else to do. A few chapters later, chapter 8, she appeared again. Elisha was talking to the king and had warned her to leave the area for her own safety. But as Elisha was talking to the king, she boldly approached him to appeal for her land, her property, all that she had had to abandon during the time of famine. She was persuasive then and before the king, and the king gave her all that she requested. Like the persistent widow in the Gospels, she refused to stay behind a closed door, and she refused to be shut out. But there is a lingering and nagging question of where God is in the midst of these terrible and tragic events. I know this congregation is not immune to trauma, to grief, to the sudden and seemingly senseless loss of life. And I am reminded of my own witness and awareness of news this week that told of the death of a 9-year-old Amish girl killed in a farm accident. Hospital staff, try as they might, were unable to keep her alive. I know how hard they tried. And there was no Elisha to breathe the breath of life back into her lungs, not even a Gehazi to hold a staff of hope. I wondered then and now, where was God for her family? Where is God for all those who struggle with sudden tragedy, for all who regularly live in violence and dare to believe that if they close their doors, they can keep out what is scary or unknown outside? And what happens when locked doors, either literally or metaphorically, can't keep out unwanted guests? How do we keep from closing doors to faith when sorrow doesn't wait until we're ready to receive it as a guest? What about all those who are imprisoned, kept behind clanging, locked doors, abandoned by society at large? The truth is, there aren't easy answers. And for as many miraculous healings as there are in the Bible, there are untold stories of tragedy and loss that are not neatly resolved. Whole peoples around the world have lost the safety of homes, the ability to open doors, far less to offer hospitality. It's a wonder that faith can exist at all in those times. And yet, behind doors closed to life and to faith, hope can still slip in. Sometimes it comes in trusting in a picture too big for us to see in the moment. Often it comes in the presence of a community that enters sacred and aching places with us and stays, offering a casserole, a hand to hold, a shoulder to cry on. For the Amish family, it was the community that gathered in grief and faith that did and will sustain them. Grief isn't swept away, but it's held in a bigger embrace amidst the empty spaces left behind. Sometimes God's intervention is held in this tiny, invisible, but life-sustaining promise that we are not alone. God knows our name, even if no one else seems to, and calls to us in our struggles. Hope doesn't always mean a reversal of the worst news we can imagine. Faith doesn't keep bad things from happening. Healing doesn't always mean that we can continue on as we did before. The hospitality we offer doesn't always come back to us in ways that we would choose. Sometimes doors close to us that we can't or won't open. But one more word appears 3 times in the story, and that is look. Look invites us to see beyond doors and singular days. Look invites us to see how God works behind the scenes and through unexpected events. Like the Shunammite woman, we hold on to hope that emboldens our spirits, guides us to name what we need, even if it seems no one's listening. God hears us, calls to us, sometimes through the gathered community, leading us to life in whatever form it will take. May it be so.